Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking an objective look at a totally fascinating and honestly highly consequential dynamic: how the Trump administration interacted with scientific consensus across a whole bunch of different academic disciplines. Now, to be clear right up front, we aren't here to take political sides. We're doing this to understand the literal mechanics of what happens when a government deliberately contradicts established scientific and academic insights. We're going to explore the specific political goals behind these actions, looking at everything from climate science and macroeconomics all the way to international law. Take a look at this quote from Harvard historian of science, Naomi Oreskes. It really sets the stage for us today. It highlights this massive, pivotal shift in modern governance. We're looking at a time where rejecting the consensus of independent experts wasn't just, an accidental byproduct of governing. It actually became a central operational policy directive. But why? What is the actual utility of systematically sidelining experts? Well, to answer that, we're going to look through 6 specific lenses today. First, the strategy of sidelining science. Second, climate versus consensus. Third, macroeconomics and tax policy. Fourth, law and political science. Fifth, the anthropological perspective. And finally, bureaucratic resistance. All right, starting with Section 1, the strategy of sidelining science, the political utility. Let's look at how this builds into a very deliberate political strategy, rather than just some random anti-intellectualism. The absolutely crucial point to understand here is that rejecting science was used as a highly calculated tool. Think about it. If you accept the scientific consensus on, say, climate change or economic forecasting, you are strictly bound by the policy constraints those facts create, right? By actively sidelining the science, the administration basically created a blank slate. This allowed them to justify massive environmental deregulation, push through selective tax policies completely against the advice of leading economists, reshape foreign policy, and ultimately rally a political base that already felt deeply alienated by traditional institutional elites. Moving on to Section 2, climate claims versus consensus, the environmental goal. Let's see exactly how this dynamic played out in the environmental sphere. Notice the stark contrast here. On one side, the administration publicly claimed that high-emissions climate scenarios, specifically the one known as RCP 8.5, were just wrong. They literally went so far as to call them a hoax and even release their own contrarian climate report. But on the flip side, independent climate scientists and fact-checkers quickly stepped in. They pointed out that the government's report totally mischaracterized how these scenarios are even developed in the first place, and researchers actually documented over 100 false or misleading claims in that government publication. So you have this objective consensus directly dismantling the political narrative. And this isn't just some abstract theory, it had incredibly tangible impacts. Take a look at these USGS scientists studying ice mass loss in Glacier National Park. Under these policies, researchers exactly like this found their grant proposals deliberately delayed or sometimes entirely suppressed by political appointees. The clear goal was to avoid confronting and publishing the very data that confirmed the reality of climate change. So you might be wondering, why go to such incredible lengths to suppress environmental data? Well, it served a very clear political utility. By framing environmental protection as a job killer and just a bureaucratic hoax, which, by the way, was a narrative that strongly resonated with a base already worried about industrial decline, the administration provided the necessary cover to push a massive deregulation agenda. We're talking about rolling back the Clean Power Plan, opening up protected national forests in the Arctic to lucrative drilling, and famously exiting the Global Paris Climate Accord. Okay, Section 3, Macroeconomics and Tax Policy, the Fiscal Goal. It turns out it wasn't just climate scientists being ignored. Macroeconomists face the exact same dynamic. During the drafting of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Treasury Secretary loudly claimed that over 100 people were running models proving that the proposed $1.5 trillion tax plan would entirely pay for itself through explosive economic growth. However, the consensus of independent macroeconomists, and get this, even the government's own Treasury experts, told a completely different story. In fact, Treasury economists later stated they were actively barred from running comprehensive analysis. Those extensive reports the Secretary was touting, they literally did not exist. Because the expert consensus was so systematically ignored, the legislation went through based on political claims rather than actual economic reality. And man, the results were immediate. In just the final 3 quarters of the 2018 fiscal year alone, those tax cuts added an estimated $164 billion to the federal deficit. That structurally debunked the administration's initial, unvetted claims of a policy that would just magically pay for itself. On to Section 4, Law and Political Science, the geopolitical goal. Let's shift our focus internationally and see how global relations were affected. Political scientists who analyze this era have actually coined a specific term for the emerging foreign policy approach. They call it transactionalist realism. And it's a pretty fascinating amalgamation. It actively eschews those multilateral win-win scenarios that international relations experts and legal scholars have favored for decades. Instead, it adopts a super strict zero-sum materialist worldview. In really simple terms, it operates on the core belief that for America to win, someone else mathematically has to lose. And by systematically dismantling incredibly complex international pacts like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Agreement, and the Iran nuclear agreement, the administration put that exact zero-sum worldview into practice. Once again, ignoring the consensus of global geopolitical and legal experts served a distinct political purpose. It catered directly to an America First nationalist framework that absolutely prioritized aggressive unilateral action over traditional global cooperation. Section 5, the anthropological perspective, the societal goal. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Let's look at how cultural anthropologists examine the social mechanics of this era. When cultural anthropologists look at this period, they identify the deliberate creation of an unreality. They point out how rule by Twitter and the explicit abandonment of traditional, kind of boring political rationality created this mesmerizing spectacle. In this space, performative outrage basically replaces the mundane administration of the state, and false news actively shapes reality. And this wasn't just accidental chaos. It was an incredibly powerful way to captivate a public that felt deeply, deeply alienated by the traditional, polished political establishment. Which leads us to a really profound, almost paradoxical question that anthropologists and cultural theorists have been grappling with. Why would certain demographics vote for platforms that honestly don't economically favor them? Like, for instance, why would massive agricultural communities who heavily rely on intricate, expert-designed farm policies and international trade agreements vote for a platform that aggressively disrupts those exact systems? Well, cultural theorists call this the double refusal. The answer really lies in the incredible political utility of alienation. See, voters rejected established experts and the whole consensus of liberalism because they felt that the so-called voice of reason had entirely forgotten them. They felt totally left behind by globalization and coastal economies. So they engaged in this double refusal, blaming outside groups for their economic conditions while simultaneously rejecting the traditional scientific and political elites who seemed to look down on them. For these voters, ignoring science wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It was a complete rejection of the establishment. All right, Section 6, Bureaucratic Resistance, the Legacy. Let's move to our final section and take a look at the quiet resistance that happened from within the government itself. Despite these sweeping, top-down political mandates to just erase mentions of climate change or ignore long-term economic data, institutional players exercised what scholars call institutional autonomy. The bureaucrats and civil servants didn't just blindly follow orders to delete facts. Instead, they used their discretion to strategically embed crucial scientific data, basically hiding it in deep technical appendices, long-term impact charts, and official regulatory footnotes, just to ensure the data survived the administration. This really highlights the incredible resilience of expertise. By embedding this data, civil servants quietly laid the essential groundwork for future legal challenges by environmental lawyers who were seeking to reverse the administration's rollbacks. Federal career scientists noted they definitely didn't do this as partisan hacks. They did it as a profound civic and professional duty, ensuring that objective science ultimately remained on the official record to protect the public. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a vital question. In a post-expertise era where the spectacle so often replaces the real, can democratic policy actually survive when the objective consensus of science is treated as just another political opinion to be discarded?